Hey everybody, this is Brent from The Second Look. Tonight I have the pleasure of speaking with Jeff Phungglan. Jeff, nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you, Brent. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. Very excited to chat with you. We have a lot to discuss, but I always like to start with the beginning. Maybe give me where this career, this path that you've chosen. How did it all begin? What were some of the building blocks to get you started?
Yeah, so somewhere in high school, I discovered this little program on my computer called Windows Movie Maker. And I always like to say I worked backwards in the kind of production cycle, right? So I got into the editing process fairly young, but quickly learned that if I wanted stuff to edit, I had to shoot stuff. And if I wanted to shoot stuff, I had to direct stuff. And that meant I had to write stuff.
Okay.
So over the course of like a year or two, I kind of worked my way backwards to the very beginning of the production cycle. But fortunately for me, I had a lot of supportive people around me that really wanted to help me out and just like be a part of it. So I didn't have a community in high school of other kids or students that wanted to do production or theater or any of that stuff. I just had a lot of really supportive adults in my life that if I asked, "Will you improv this scene with me?" They said yes, and they jumped right in. And then I graduated high school a couple years early, went to Bible college, and just like every great Bible student, I finished and said, "Hey, I'm going to move to LA to chase my dreams of film and TV." My parents were super stoked about that pivot, but yeah, so we moved to LA, and LA is a very expensive city. So I kind of fell into a career outside of production itself or the creative career path, but always because it's LA, tangential and working within studios. So I've worked at quite a few different studios, large studios, and got to kind of be a fly on the wall and see productions happening and kind of production adjacent. And then through that process, I'd been creating and just did the whole making short films with friends on the weekends. And then life kind of happened, I got married, I had kids, and then the pandemic happened. And at that point, I really didn't have a strong reason to stay in LA as much as I was kind of kicking and screaming, trying to plant my feet there.
Yeah.
But with my wife's family being from Georgia and Atlanta kind of blowing up at that moment
Mm,
in production, we said, hey, let's try to save some money at the very least
hmm
and test our waters out in Georgia and see what that's like. And that has completely transformed my career, to be totally honest. And where I was going from making a short film every, couple years whenever I could save up the money to do that, I've been able to take that and expedite it and kind of make a short every year here and really grow my network. And so I've over the course of the 4 years that I've been here, I've made one documentary short and two narrative shorts. And now I'm embarking on my first feature film, which I'm super excited.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a great story. I think, yeah, Atlanta, that makes a lot of sense. Just as a secondary or tertiary production hub,
Yeah.
if you're gonna move away from like or New York, that's
Right.
probably the best place to go.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say, like, because the state at large has really welcomed the production environment, they've really amped up their infrastructure. And so they're like, you can't find any Georgia school that doesn't have some type of film program or creative writing program, right? And so what that has allowed is this vibrant indie community that is just so hungry and so welcoming. And I've really found that the community here at large has just been super inviting to
Mm,
me
yeah,
and open arms with pretty much everybody in a way that's unmatched to any other city I've lived in.
yeah, that doesn't sound like LA.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really hard to go from LA, such a studio centric and studio run city, to Atlanta, where they just want to make great art.
Mm,
They want to get paid and they want to work on the studio stuff. There's no doubt about that. But like at the same time, there is the room for the indie projects.
okay, so yeah, let's talk about that a little bit because people maybe they've heard that Atlanta is a place to do things, but what exactly is there that you were able to jump right into, like smaller production companies that are doing commercials or whatever, or like how did you get into the community?
Yeah, I really found kind of two avenues. One, just the indie film community. There are so many different, like the Atlanta Film Society is incredible. They have this event called Eat, Drink, and Be Indie that they do once a month, and it's basically like some type of panel and mixer event every month. There is, two really great local theaters, classic theaters, the Plaza and the Terra, that just thrive on supporting indie and foreign movies and just the really hard to find films. And then there's a really, like, I don't know that it has generated contacts or anything of that nature for me, but there is a really awesome video store here called Videodrome. And for, the first year or two, I had just would commit to coming out to that store once a week to rent, four or five Blu-rays. I didn't even have a Blu-ray player when I discovered this place. I rented all these movies and was like, how am I supposed to watch these? I should do something. Like, I need to buy something. So I bought a Blu-ray player because of this store. And it has just like, it has changed my appreciation as a cinephile. And it has created a hunger in me that like wasn't necessarily there. It's something I'd always wanted to tap into, but wasn't there
Yeah.
prior to being there. And then the other thing is that I don't think Georgia gets enough credit for our API community here. And that has been a big thing. And there's been so much crossover between AAPI filmmakers and AAPI artists in general. It's just such a beautiful and vibrant community that the two worlds really have like been my lifeline to staying involved in film.
Right. Wow. That's great. It seems like pretty daunting, I think, for anybody to move to a different city, a different state, to start over with, whatever. Did you have any contacts when you
No,
showed up?
no. So that was always my reason. Like I had my tribe in LA that I loved working with, and like those were my people. They still are my people.
Yeah.
I always tease like, hey, like maybe I can get enough in this crowdfunding campaign to fly you out. Like I'm always trying to work my people back here.
Yeah.
But the I knew nobody. I knew my in-laws, and that was it. And like I was really I always joke and say I was bamboozled a little bit because my in-laws are always like, we only lived like 16 exits from the city, but that's like 40 minutes, And so like at a certain point I was being gaslit to be like, maybe I'm just like overreacting. Maybe it's not that far. It's really far still. I don't want to downplay that in any way. But now that I get it, like, it's kind of like LA. Nobody actually lives in LA or Atlanta. Like we live
Yeah.
on the outskirts.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and I guess I wanna go back a little bit. You were talking about in high school, you got into this, and there was not any resources for you there, and it sounds like you didn't go to, like, film school proper, right?
Right, I did not. One of the things that, like, when I met so I mentioned that I, graduated high school early,
Yeah.
and so my mom was not super thrilled about letting me go away to university or college, but I kind of found the best of both worlds by saying, "Hey, I found a Bible college." Doesn't matter that it's in Las Vegas, let's just forget that part, but it's a Bible college, right? And so when I met with them, they were actually looking for somebody to amp up and build out a pseudo media program for them. And so at that point, I was like, yeah, I dabble in that stuff, sure. And so I met one of my really good friends to this day, Danny Salazar, a great collaborator of mine, and we kind of built out this program, so to speak. And we eventually both got hired by the school and the church at large to produce, help with a weekly TV show and film their weekly services. And then we'd also do like these kind of ads for different departments or different ministries. And so that was just like a battleground for us because we were producing 3 to 5 different ads every week, basically, in addition to helping out with any supplemental
Mhm.
clips they needed for their weekly TV broadcast.
Wow, that's great. Film school as a concept is also kind of daunting for people, especially where do I go? Do I need to go to the big 3? Do I have money? Am I gonna be in debt forever? There's lots of big questions related to film school, but I think what your story kind of illustrates is that you can kind of make a film school for yourself,
Yeah,
like where
exactly.
you're at, and to take an opportunity like that to work for the school, like, oh yeah, like we'll do some stuff. Like I think just the taking every opportunity that comes your way in this area, I think is beneficial to you, right? That's
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in like just being totally transparent, like film school was not on the radar, let alone did I know what a good film school was prior to going into that. And I just got very fortunate and very lucky that another mentor and friend of mine happened to be going through the film program at the community college in Vegas.
Mm.
And was a massive cinephile and film buff. And so, like, in addition to what I was producing and working on, he was also supplying me with like, oh, you have to watch these movies. These are the
Mm-mm.
things you need to do.
Right.
So I kind of had this film history class,
Yeah.
in friend form.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And then the video store you're talking about, I love that because that's it's a film school
Yeah,
in itself. So you have all this opportunity outside of what is traditionally, quote unquote, a film school.
yeah, and I think I like we're all creatives, right? Like that's why we go into this film, so or to this career, and so if we don't have the resources, we got to figure out other ways of making it happen. And for me, one of those was I had I had seen Edgar Wright a couple years ago had posted like an end of year wrap up. I think it was the year he released Last Night in Soho. So he released that, and then he released a Sparks Brothers documentary. And then, like December 28th or something, he posted, "Hey, I watched 240 movies this year, in addition to releasing and creating two movies. Like, not bad, right?" And like something in me was like, "I need to watch a movie every day. Like, if he can do it, I can do it. I can find a way to make this happen."
Yeah.
And so that happened, and then, like, I would say maybe 2 months later, I found the video store, and so I was like, "This is perfect. I'm gonna just go rent a week's worth of movies from the store."
Yeah.
Honestly, I had no research before I walked into the store every week. I was just like, "I'm gonna pick up 1 AAPI movie, I'm gonna pick up 1 French New Wave, I'm gonna pick up, 1 Cassavetes movie, and, like, figure out just feel vibes for the other 2."
Right. Right, right. Yeah, and once you do that, you watch that movie, and then that, like, oh, there's that director or that actor, like, oh, I wanna, and
Yeah.
then you just find yourself like branching out into everything.
Exactly, and, like, I can't tell you how many times I was just like I picked a movie based purely on the cover. Like, I didn't even read it. I was just like, whatever. This is one of my 5 this week."
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I was doing that as a in like a junior high, just
Yeah,
not from like a I want to be a filmmaker yet. I hadn't really put those things together, but just the joy, the exploration, like the surprise of what a movie would be based on a cover, and kind of taking that leap. And sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not so great, but I
it
think there's something to learn from all of that. Yeah,
100%.
that's I just wanna, again, appreciate the study of film because my background is much more on the academic side, on the studies side, the theory side, you know? I've done my fair share of production and my own films and such, but I just think that part of it is not appreciated enough because there's a whole world of how to do something, how to use a camera, how to use the latest gear or whatever. But then what you really need as like a foundation is like the why. Like why would you use that camera? Why that lighting? It looks cool, but how is it helping the story? And like if you're not going to a film school where people are like explaining this stuff to you, at the very least, you're watching movies and you're noticing things like, oh, like I see the patterns that they're using, that same kind of lighting for this kind of scene, and like that makes sense now, and like make it kind of connecting those dots on your own.
100%, and I think, I've kind of divided up the films that I've made in my, like, my LA films and my, like, Georgia trilogy is what I'm calling them, and I think my Georgia trilogy is stronger in the fact that I have been more intentional with the decisions that I'm making, and
Hmm.
a great example of that is in my short documentary. I use a lot of it's about my family and our immigration story, so I use a lot of stock footage, but one thing I was noticing as I was going through the stock is there aren't a lot of there's not a lot of Asian representation in stock footage available.
Mm,
And so I said, well, instead of trying to find stock footage that looks like I'm recreating these moments that they're talking about, why don't I just lean into it and find the whitest people I can find and really make it as hokey as possible to comment on, like, hey, this
mm,
stock footage is not available. This is not easily accessible like it is for some other people.
right. That's interesting. Yeah, that's great for sure. Using first of all a limitation, something that you're lacking, whether it be funds or equipment or resources of any kind, but then finding the creative solution out of that can like that's not just creative and kind of a novelty, but actually does service your message and what you're trying to say. So you checked all the boxes with that. That's great.
Yeah. And it's funny because there's one clip where I was able to find a Southeast Asian character in there, and I added him in, and that is the one clip everyone's like, "Wait, who's that guy?" And so it's like very noticeable that, like,
Yeah,
oh, hey, there's only one like really prominent Asian stock person, and it catches everybody off guard when they see it.
sure. Right. Right. That juxtaposition. It's
Yeah,
it's that having that one clip in there is even though like you said you only found one, but just putting that one in has an impact that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't included it, right?
right.
It's like
Yeah.
it
If I
created.
would have mixed it up or tried to, like,
Yeah,
hide the limitation versus just saying, "No, this is the reality that I live in as
yeah,
a nation."
yeah. That's great. I guess so. Okay, I wanna focus in more on this on your story, your family. Where you're from, like the immigrant story. I'm really interested in, and how are you bringing that into your work?
Yeah, so I am half Thai, and my Thai family doesn't really have a, like, sad sob story. Like, we do, it's very traumatic, but it's not like refugee. Like, my family wasn't escaping war, my family wasn't being persecuted in any way, and so I feel like a lot of times there are two buckets for Asian storytellers, and that's either this refugee escaping to America for a better life, or the crazy rich Asian that has everything that just wants to flaunt it all.
Mm,
And so I've always struggled with, like, I know this is a huge identity piece for me, but how do I bring this into my stories? And so my biological grandfather passed away when my father was very young. He was 5 or 6. And my grandmother met the grandfather that I know.
mm,
He was an American GI over there for Vietnam and was sent to Thailand for some R&R. And because of the circumstance, she had to leave one morning with him and come back to
mm,
America if they were going to be married and have a family. And so what that meant is that one day my father woke up and had to go live with friends of family, and had him he had 3 sisters, 4 sisters at the time. One of them went to America with my grandma, and the other 3 were spread out across Thailand. So they did not live together. They would occasionally get to visit each other because of circumstances, but they didn't know where their mom was. They heard that
mm,
she was in America, and before internet, before really mass media, they didn't know really where America even was in relation to where they were. And so that lasted for about 5 or 6 years before they were finally together again. And then they had to adapt to being this military family that was in Germany for 2 years. So they didn't even come to, like, their home for a few years. And then they ended up in America, where my grandfather was finally stationed locally, and it was a better situation for them. All in all, at the end of the day, it worked out, and it was a very fortunate situation, a pretty fortunate immigrant experience. But the result of that family separation has been just generational trauma that has rolled through. And so that the family separation piece has always is something I realized in making the documentary, and has shaped the way I tell stories. And I think, like, this idea of shattered families and trying to reconnect has been a major theme for
mm,
me. And then at the same time, like, where do family loyalties lie
Mm,
when maybe you don't really know your family, or maybe your family has willingly left and now you're trying to keep those pieces together, you know?
mhm, yeah.
And that has really been a through line from all the narrative features or narrative pieces I've worked on since that doc.
Wow, yeah, that's an incredible story, and I mean, I've only watched your pitch video for May I, and I can
Yeah.
already see what you're talking about, like, that seems to be part of that story as well,
Yes.
and and very strongly presented, like, even in those couple minutes, I got that sense, so that's a testament to you and your skills.
Thank you.
How do you I'm always curious, especially with people who have a connection to another place that I don't, right? And as an artist, as a filmmaker, like, are you connected, or do you try to connect with the art and the film from Thailand, let's say? Are you trying to bring that in? Because I know you're big on bringing the Asian experience and representation into your work. Is it specifically like Thai representation, and like, maybe, I mean, my experience with Thai filmmaking is very limited.
Yeah.
I only
Understandably.
I
Yeah.
only know really a couple filmmakers. I love their work, but how is that working for you?
Yeah, as one as an Asian American and one as a mixed race, biracial American or
Mhm.
Thai white person, there is a certain kind of dichotomy, push and pull within me as within my identity, anyways. So I find myself trapped between like I'm for sure not Thai enough, and I'm definitely not white or American enough in
Yeah,
circles. And so, I've taken a lot of inspiration from Thai cinema. Like I said, Videodrome has been an incredible resource. They stock so many Thai movies, and that's where I've watched all of them. But even that is limited. And I don't want to say like I am trying to represent Thai media in any way. I think it's part of this third culture that I'm learning to embrace, is that I'm an Asian American, which is totally different than either end, somewhere in between. And so that is where I think you'll see a lot of that in my work also, is this push and pull of like, who am I as an individual versus who am I to my family, or who am I to my culture?
yeah,
And as a filmmaker, one thing I'm learning is like diversity is not super hard. You just have to be intentional about it again,
yeah,
right?
right,
And so, whereas, my last short was about two Korean sisters, and it was about around a Korean concept that I had personally felt very attached to and wanted to elaborate on. But not all of the actors in that film are Korean, but they're phenomenal actors, and I wanted to try to honor that as much as possible. But in that being said, with this feature, May I really wanted to just take the opportunity to say, no, I'm going to be even more intentional and say, this is a story about Thai people, because I maybe that might not be as different from Thai people to Korean people or to Japanese people or even to Latino people or any immigrant in general.
yeah,
But there is some nuance that I maybe can bring as somebody who is an outsider trying to observe this culture,
mm,
that has some stake in it.
right, right. Yeah, I like what you said. Representation, diversity is not difficult. Like, this is it as a concept, as a process. It's the easiest thing in the world, right? And I'd like to say that I'm seeing great great progress being made, in a lot of different areas. It's definitely not as like quick as it should be, because we have decades in America. We have decades of film that kind of pretty much excluded all of it, and so there's a lot of catch up that we're trying to do. But how do you feel about the current state of kind of where, especially Hollywood filmmaking is?
That's a very difficult question, especially in the studio realm, because we're watching the very rapid decline of it. So
Yeah.
Any movie being made feels like a win for me. And anytime I can go to the theater, I'm excited.
Yeah.
But, like the fact that we're in 2025 and Sinners was as big of a monumental movement is wonderful, but also feels like, why are we only just here? You know, I feel like we could be doing so much better, and my day job is in advertising. So I work in that realm a lot. And in the almost decade that I've been in that, I've only worked at a company that has done one all female production, and that is insane to me because
Yeah.
I would say the last 10 years is probably the most progressive both the advertising and film world have been. And for me to only have seen one full production in that manner,
Yeah.
it's not great. I think we need to be
Yeah.
doing better. And one thing I always try to do is, you know, I need to advocate for Asian American storytellers. And so when producers bring me directors to look at, I always go, okay, well, how many Asian Americans do we have on this list? And I remember being part of a comedy campaign, and I myself was working with my art director partner who was Korean American. Our producer was Chinese American. So, like, half of us on this advertising side were all Asian Americans. And my producer just turned to me and said, there aren't comedic Asian American directors that we can pull from. And I was like, how is this possible? Like, and unfortunately, Alan Yang from Parks and Rec and Master of None and Aziz Ansari are the only ones I was able to pull. And we didn't have the budget for them, obviously. But it's sad that that's the state that
Yeah.
it is in. I don't know that that's improved any, and if it has, very marginally. You have the John M. Chews of the world, but again, they're only on such a high level. We need
Yeah.
more indie and more mid tier directors and filmmakers that can be called upon.
Right. Yeah, no, it's true. I think if you're only, and I'm just realizing now, like what my perception of what I described as progress is limited to whatever I see, on the big screen, like the Hollywood releases. But if you go down, like you're saying, like if the further down you go, like into the mid tier and lower tier kind of projects, maybe it's not like the average. It's still a huge discrepancy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, like the only other one I maybe can think of since that time period is Andrew On from Fire Island and The Wedding Banquet, you know.
Mm-mm.
But the one in the last 8 years that has risen up out of that group, like we need,
Right.
yeah, just be nice to have a little more. We don't need a lot, just a little.
So okay, so this is great segue. The feature you're in kind of pre-production on that you have a campaign for. You mentioned it's part of an AAPI like initiative. Can you
Yeah.
explain how that works?
Yeah, so we're currently crowdfunding on Seed and Spark, and Seed and Spark partnered with Gold House, which is another kind of AAPI organization that spotlights Asians and Asian Americans in media. And so they're hosting this API Renaissance rally, and part of that is they want to push back on Asian stereotypes. So for a project to qualify, it has to have an AAPI lead. The AAPI lead can't have the defining characteristics of being a martial artist or being intelligent. And so when I saw this being posted, I realized, hey, I'm an Asian American director. I don't know martial arts and I'm not very smart. So this seems like I should have a story to tell in this realm. And it worked out. And it's sad that like those are such easy qualifications, but that's where we're at. And so that I wanted to jump on this opportunity.
Okay. So are they kind of co-funding, or is there a grant or something?
Yeah, so there are two really cool aspects of this. They're offering up to $10,000 in matching funds. uh, you have to reach the green light on your crowdfunding campaign, which is 80%. So for us, it's $8,000, not a huge amount. But we're hoping to raise $10,000 altogether, hopefully to get the full $10,000 matching fund. But on top of that, they're offering mentorship from some really, really great mentors, people that are running production companies, people that are VPs of development at other organizations. You have Daniel Scheinhardt, one of the directors of Everything Everywhere All at Once. You have writer Jeff Yang. So, some really great people that are out there and do have a platform that could offer some insight and really help take our project to the next level.
Right. Okay. Okay, so you had to get the script approved or something? Like, how did that process work?
Yeah, so it's just a matter of putting the pitch video up there and going through the work of the crowdfunding campaign itself.
Okay.
And so again, like I said, you have to reach 80% of your goal, and you also have to hit 350 followers on Seed and Spark. And so
Okay.
that's the kind of tricky one, because 350 may not sound like a lot, because on Instagram and all these other social platforms we've kind of amassed these larger followings.
Right.
I know I myself have like 600 or 700 on Instagram. Like, that's half of my followers, whatever. But that's a lot of people to ask to go to a whole other platform, create an account, and follow you. So it's the one everyone I think is taking a little for granted.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So tell me about the story of May I, and kind of where, what did you have this story, well, it sounds like you came up with it in response to the prompt or whatever. Is that true?
Yeah, so I kind of call it kismet, call it coincidence, call it whatever. I had actually been working on this and kind of finished the first kind of, I don't want to, it's a little bit longer than an outline, maybe like a scriptlet for that the night before they announced this Renaissance rally. And so it was just one of those things where I was like, all right, like, this is happening.
Yeah, yeah.
And they announced it and gave us about like 6 or 7 weeks to actually, before the deadline to submit. So it's like,
Okay.
I've got an idea, like, to actually, I've got a timeline. I've got to sit down and make this real. But that being said, um, this is an idea I've kind of been kicking around that hasn't fully formed until recently and in recent months. I don't know if you're familiar. Mark Duplass did a movie with Elizabeth Moss called The One I Love
Like that
with
movie.
director Charlie McDowell. Yeah, so
Yeah.
good. And I remember afterwards reading an interview with Mark Duplass saying like, "Oh, this movie the story came out of this idea of like, what would my Starman with David Bowie look like if I were to sit down and write that? How would I do it?" And I always thought that was just a really interesting way to approach stories of like, sure, there are a limited amount of ideas for stories, but like, we all have our own unique approach and take on it. And I that movie came out, I want to say like 6 or 8 years ago, somewhere in there. And since then, I've always been like, what would my take on Casablanca be? And I've always tried
Mhm,
to crack it and sit down
mhm.
and try to write that out. And nothing really came to fruition. And then our current political climate popped up, and I remember seeing the um, the footage from, like, the doorbell footage from the tough student being detained or being approached by the ICE agents, and just remember being like shaken to my core watching that. And like, it really messed me up emotionally to watch that happen, and to
Mhm.
realize that, like, I'm fortunate because I'm very white passing. I'm the first to admit that, but the rest of my family maybe not, is it cannot say that. Some, sure, but that always leaves me a little scared for them and a little more fearful of what their fate might be. And so when that started happening, the inspiration started running of like, okay, this is how my take on Casablanca comes to fruition. Really, May I is that culmination of Children of Men, Casablanca, and Civil War. And like, I sat down to watch both Children of Men and Casablanca in the same day. I don't think, like, if you just think back to what you remember from those movies, they're very different, but watching them back to back, they are very similar. I think they just focus on different relationships,
Right.
and for me, that's something I've always been wanted to tell is I'm not the person that had to deal with the family separation personally. I wasn't the one that had that, but I've had to deal with the fallout and the trauma from that. And I wanted to tell the story of what happens to everyone else around the person that is detained. And so that's where May I comes in, is it's her brother who is detained, and then where does that leave her? What are the sacrifices she has to make in order to save him, or to help her family, or how does this world that we're living in currently impact her?
Yeah. That's I think it's a great idea, first of all. A really interesting mashup of those two movies, which again, like you said, you would not put these two together, on any, themed
Yeah,
double feature or whatever, but that's what makes it interesting. And I think the it reminded me of what you were saying earlier about the documentary and juxtaposing kind of what is available and what you could find and to make a larger statement. I think choosing something like Casablanca, which especially for generations of people is this super romantic and kind of like tangentially patriotic story, but you mix it in with something that's actually happening right now that doesn't feel very patriotic or interesting. Yeah, that's
yeah.
great.
I mean, and I think the biggest thing that stuck out to me, the thing I forgot about Children of Men is like you always think it's this apocalyptic dystopian like journey to save the race of humanity, but the whole thing is the world is falling apart because they hate refugees and they're caging and detaining refugees. And then if you look at Casablanca, there's this whole love triangle that happens because like I'm blanking on her name, Isla, I think, Ingrid Bergman's character
Yep.
only opens herself up to her this romance with Rick because her partner is detained. And the whole reason they're in Morocco is because they're escaping as refugees, all three of them. And
Right.
so I think you forget all those details that are happening in the background. And that's what I was trying to tell with
Mm,
that.
mm. That's yeah, no, it's very interesting, very evocative. I think it's a really good mix of ideas. So, what's the plan? I mean, you're hoping to get like at least 20,000. That's the
Yeah.
goal, right? You have
Yeah.
it all budgeted and scheduled, and are you ready to go?
We're right now, because this is my second time crowdfunding. I'm under like because that was kind of the impetus or the catalyst really to get us actually committed to this project and moving on. And we're focusing all our efforts on the crowdfunding campaign right now. But the
Mhm.
hope is to be able to move into production either later this year or early next year. I think just at a very simple, basic level, production design level, as we were scouting locations for the pitch video, I was joking with my crew. I was like, does Atlanta really look like a dystopian world just naturally, or have we just shot everything dystopian here so Atlanta feels dystopian for that reason? But it has this city is what people a lot of people don't know unless you live here is that it's a city in a forest. And that's why it has that overgrown feel a lot of times. And it's
Mm,
really easy to see. And it has a lot of history and there's a lot of old relics and destroyed and decaying infrastructure
mm,
that you can kind of stumble upon that lends itself to that dystopia. But without that greenery and that forestry in swing, it can feel a little barren and it can feel a little scarce. So as a team, we're trying to decide like, does it make sense to rush production so that we can get the ball moving and actually shoot this because we're all very excited about it, or does it make sense to wait until it has a chance to for us to cash in on that lush greenery that is here and available to us.
right. An available location or a
Right.
resource,
Yeah.
but yeah, you have to take advantage while it's there, and something there's a catch to it. It's not just gonna be there.
Yeah. And listen, I'm an Arizona kid. I went to Bible college in Las Vegas. I lived in LA for 14 years. So I'm a desert guy through and through. So anytime I see greenery, I'm like, ooh, that looks cinematic and something I'm not used to.
Yeah,
That looks expensive.
yeah, and and I imagine having that locale environment definitely, I'm sure, informed the story and what it looks like in your head, right? Because you know you're going to be shooting around there. So like, I just like I like to point out like a good tip for people is always like to use what you have
Mhm.
around you, available to you to build your stories around, and not to try and force it. If you don't have that thing, why force it? Try to find a way to use what you have. So is that part of your process with this project? Is like it's almost like if you were still in Vegas, you wouldn't maybe even be able to do it, right?
Yeah, I think it'd be a very different story. I think we'd be exploring like the underground Vegas scene and what that looks like, and is there hiding capabilities in there?
Yeah,
Because we're here, one of the locations we shot the pitch video at, we didn't know until after we shot, but it was actually used in Civil War, uh,
I saw that.
and they had the tent camps there.
Yeah.
Just looking at the way they set that up, I was like, that could very easily be a refugee camp if you didn't have the context of the rest of the story. And so, yeah, I do think that where I'm at has informed the story. And as far as like how she kind of hides and creeps around the city and has learned to navigate, I think has definitely informed it. And it's set in a city, not a rural area, because again, as a minority, I think there is a little bit of unspoken community that happens in a city where people maybe share a similar experience and can see, oh, okay, this person's hiding or this person needs
Mm,
help. So I'm gonna turn the other way and pretend I don't see them, and I don't have to do anything weird, and they can stay safe.
mhm.
And so I think those things definitely informed the story.
This is your first feature. Are you prepared to tackle a feature? Are you nervous? I mean,
Are we
I
ever
know
prepared for a feature?
that's very true. I'm just kind of always interested in when people make the leap, and what the experience was like. Usually, the people I've talked to is usually after the fact. But how are you feeling now? And like maybe what do you anticipate being your challenges?
A feature has always been the goal, I guess. A feature has always. I tried to when I moved to Georgia. I didn't know what my future held, and so I had come to this place where I was just grateful to make anything.
Mm,
I just wanted to make films. That's something I've known about myself for the last 20 years. So whether that was a feature or a short, I wanted to keep making movies, whatever capacity. I also have 3 children and a full-time job, and so like shorts are the accessible thing for me in that moment. But at this point, after making three shorts back to back like that, I felt like, okay, maybe I could write another feature. I have a couple just sitting in the desk drawer, so to speak, but I wanted to see if there was something new and fresh that I could mine. And I felt like, this was it. This was the time. And I had started to feel that way after wrapping up my previous short of like, okay, maybe I can do it. The thing that has always stressed me out and keeps stressing me out is the actual production length and being in the advertising world and having a few, you know, 5, 6 day shoots has helped me like kind of
yeah.
break out of the idea of like I can only do a 2 or 3 day shoot. Um,
Mhm.
but I've also with Jelly Bean, my most recent short, it was a 2 day principal shoot, and then I ended up having to do 3 different pickups throughout the course of post production,
Mm,
and that was like, yeah, I could have condensed that down to one day of pickups, but it was just like, okay, I have talent available. I'm able to just run and gun with my camera, so let me just shoot what I need right now, and then I can sit with the edit for a bit. And so now I've seen like, okay, it doesn't have to necessarily be all 8 days straight or 22 days straight. Like I can break it up over the course of 2 weekends a month for 3 months.
yeah, totally.
And so that's kind of how I've approached May I is I've tried to write it in, 6 kind of big set pieces. And if I
Mm,
can ground each of those 6 set pieces in one location with a few sporadic company moves, then
mm,
maybe I can address it and tackle it in 6 weekends if I need to
mm.
you know so I'm trying to write the script and keep production in mind as and keep it as nimble as possible and as flexible as possible, so not just writing for what I have currently, but writing for what suits the story, but keeping it as contained and flexible as possible.
That's great. That's really interesting, because I you don't hear about that. You hear about, like, these sporadic shoots over weekends, over, like Christopher Nolan and following, like, it took him forever, and he's shooting in little pieces because he had no choice. But that's out of necessity, but it can also work for you. Like you're saying, like, if you can build it that way, that seems a lot more manageable than a solid 22 days in a row, and you have to get everything because that's how much money you have, and it's all there's a lot of pressure there. So I I I'm commending you on thinking it through that way, because there's models for this process, for this art, that have been kind of ground into us, but there's always alternatives, there's always ways to work around it, and I think that's clearly one of those alternatives that people should probably consider.
Yeah, and for me, I think filmmakers kind of fall into the trap of being like, "Oh, I want to make Interstellar or I want to make," but if you're just making your first feature, Christopher Nolan didn't make Oppenheimer on his first feature.
Right.
I think you have to go back to filmmakers'
Yeah.
first movies and really examine what they did and how they did it, because you're
Mhm.
not going to get to Oppenheimer until you make the following, right? Like
Yeah.
that's just the reality of the situation. So as throughout my career and film watching and film studies, I've always just gravitated to directors' first features and
Mm.
just tried to dissect those movies as opposed to dissecting, Last Night in Soho instead of dissecting Shaun of the Dead. I grab inspiration from newer movies, and obviously I
Yeah.
don't just look at these new wave indie stuff, but I think you've got to kind of go back and forth and understand what the limitations were then and how you can adapt that to today's technology.
Yes, I love that. I'm gonna steal that idea of watch when you're starting out, when you're trying to get inspired, when you're trying to kind of gather this momentum, is to watch early films and try to imagine it that way, because, right, takes years and many movies to get up to where you would want to be. And I think you're right that, um, I guess, expectation that people have, for themselves or for their films, like, uh, are always too high, like, and it's good. It's something. There's
Gives you
always
something
something
to
to,
aim
like,
for.
aim for, but, let's be realistic, and it might be simpler, and it might be, smaller, but it's doable. You can finish it. The next one can be a little bit more complicated. Like, take your time. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Like, those kind of that ethos, is really important for people to keep in mind.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, there are, like you mentioned earlier, there are so many examples. You just
Mm,
have to look for them and be
mhm.
open to, like, not saying you have to make 12 Angry Men, but look to it to see how they staged a 2 hour movie in one room, and how they kept it dynamic and interesting. And what can you extrapolate from that and bring it to 2025?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's easy to forget that Spielberg, someone like him, right? What is he doing? He's for his little home movies that he's making, right? And, like, you have to start there. You have to acknowledge that that's where you need to start, and not feel even, like, disappointed or whatever about, like, it's negative energy. You don't need that. You need that positive reinforcement. Like, okay, I have to do it this way.
Yeah. And I feel like, if I can throw one kind of role or department head under the bus a little bit in this specific discussion, and I
Mhm.
think the person who's probably the most disappointed when I'm trying to bring people on and talk about, my shorts and whatnot for that I want to collaborate on, it's typically the DP, because
Mm.
they do want to make something beautiful and they do want to make Oppenheimer. And if they are disappointed, then you're talking to the right person. because that means that they're going to push the image, right? And so I usually try to bring them back to the point of like, let's shoot for Oppenheimer, but if we make it better than the following, then we're in a good place, right? So like from a story wise, I'll pull from the following, you can pull from Oppenheimer, but like let's meet somewhere in the middle.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, your department heads have their own wishes and desires and visions, right? And they wanna do their best work, and they wanna flex those muscles. You have to remind them, like you have to remind yourself that there's always limitations that you have to work within, make the best of what you have, and yeah. But yeah, trying to convince them of that, like, "Hey, like, we can't quite do the Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
Let's find somewhere in the middle." I think that's great. It's a great advice.
Well, and even another great example is Barry Jenkins. If you go from Medicine for Melancholia to or Medicine for to Moonlight,
Mm,
those are two drastically different movies as far as their presentation. And they are movie number one and movie number two for him. So it's a massive leap, but like you can see those things bubbling up already in Medicine for
right.
Melancholy.
Yes. Alright, Jeff, thank you so much for your time, sharing some really amazing stuff, not just from yourself, your personal life, and your family, which I really appreciate you sharing that with us, but also kind of your story as a filmmaker. We'll have all the links and everything for your project, your campaign. If anyone wants to reach out and get in touch and be part of it, which I highly recommend, we'll have that available. But again, thanks for your time, and I wish you all the best with this project.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for having me, Brent.
You're welcome. All right, see ya.